So I'm welcoming Matt Huber. As a reminder, questions into the chat. I will call on them at the Q&A following Matt's presentation. Nuclear New York is a nonpartisan organization, so the socialist case is being made by Matt, hopefully as passionate as possible. But we at Nuclear New York welcome all strides and political orientations, well, with some exceptions, no Nazis allowed and stuff like that. But let's get started. Matt?
All right, Dietmar, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at Syracuse University. I've studied energy for many years and Marxism for many years, but I've only, most of my research was on oil and the oil industry, and I've only recently become really interested in electricity. And my roots are in environmentalism, and it took me a long time to come around to the pro-nuclear position, but I'm quite enthusiastic now, and I'm excited to try to make this case for the socialist case for nuclear power. And I hope, can you all see this? Yeah. I did sort of assume that this group is pretty familiar with why nuclear is really good. So I'm gonna try to talk a lot about what socialism is and give you a kind of socialist perspective on electricity to then sort of make the case how nuclear fits into that very well. So this is kind of the big picture outline of what I want to cover today, and I hope to be able to do so in about 30 to 40 minutes. So just let's get right to it. First, I want us to, this is not the official version of what socialism is, but some key principles. I don't know if someone can mute themselves, but obviously these are ideas rooted in Karl Marx and also a variety of socialist movements, parties, and organizations. But some basic principles. Socialists believe that we should produce things for social and human needs. In other words, what is useful to humans to allow humans to flourish in society. And our main problem with capitalism is that production is organized by private owners seeking profits on their investments. And you can look at energy, but also, just look at pharmaceuticals, for instance. Some would say it's quite mad that we organize the production of medicine for profit. In fact, recently Goldman Sachs did a report where they suggested it might be bad for investors to design cures for diseases, because then you just then there's no more buying of commodities. And so we think that a lot of society's problems are rooted in the fact that all the production of things society needs is organized for profit, and that sort of subverts organizing production for human needs and social goals, in addition to, as we'll talk about later, climate and ecological goals. So this is sort of the core of our perspective. And right in this definition here is this distinction between use value and exchange value. And one of the things I want to get into is how our discussion of energy is sort of clouded by a focus on prices and markets and exchange value, and we lose sight of the usefulness of energy sources in comparison to each other. And this use value aspect is really crucial. So the other thing socialists and Marxists in particular believe is that capitalism has actually been quite great for developing what Marx called the productive forces or technology, or basically creating the industrial conditions of abundance that really didn't exist in history until around the 19th century. And Marx and Engels developed their theory in this massive industrial revolution and really believed that capitalism was kind of creating the material conditions for the first time in history to abolish class and abolish inequality, because they would argue before the Industrial Revolution, there really wasn't enough production to really go around, and you so therefore had to have these kind of feudal and quite oligarchical, monarchical sort of forms of domination. And so capitalism actually does us a favor historically by developing the productive forces, creating this abundance that we can then harness for human needs and for human ends, and to abolish class, abolish poverty, the most important thing. So one of the biggest, most important critiques of capitalism that socialists put forward is that it's really scandalous that we have so much poverty and scarcity and misery in the world when we have so much productive capacity, so much abundance. And socialists want to just extend that abundance to everyone. The other thing socialists really emphasize is that we really should be trying to take social conscious control over our economic system, preferably democratic control, and we should plan it again for human needs. And that one of the problems with capitalism is that we just sort of cede control of the economy to this mystical, almost naturalized, almost godlike force we call the market. And the market, as Marx and Engels argued, is quite anarchic. It's quite unpredictable and uncontrollable. And again, whatever it says, we just sort of accept as if that's what the market has decided, and therefore we have to just bow down. And so it's quite crazy that, for instance, in 2022, the market has told us that fossil fuels are as profitable as ever. Their stock prices are going up, and this is just what the market says, and we're supposed to accept it in the face of catastrophic climate change. And the other thing about this term, the market is quite anarchic. It sort of booms and busts and goes up and down, and it's not a very stable, planned way to organize a society. I was just listening to a marketplace report last night about the housing industry and how a year ago it was booming and could not get enough wood, lumber for house building, and there was just shortages and bottlenecks. And then now, with interest rates high, the house building industry has crashed, and they have more lumber than they know what to do with. So this kind of anarchic boom bust volatility is sort of wired into this capitalist system. But socialists would say that we should really take more control over the economy, plan it democratically for, again, social needs. Finally, socialists believe that workers and labor are the ones that really do all the work in society, create all the material wealth, and therefore this is just sort of a slogan. Socialists believe that the working class has this power inherently under capitalism to fundamentally change the world. For one, capitalism creates this kind of system where the vast majority of people rely on a wage or a salary to survive, and therefore this sort of majority is sort of democratically has this power to kind of unite against the small minority of capitalists who own and privately control production for profit. But also that because the workers are the ones that do the work to keep society running, they have tremendous power that they can go on strike and create a crisis that forces political elites to respond to their demands. That no other sort of social agent has this power of sort of being this sort of cog in the machine that keeps society running, and they can use this power to achieve incredible results, as we've seen. Just the mere threat of this rail strike has sent the most powerful people in our country sort of scrambling to try to prevent it, and so forth. So the centrality of the labor movement and workers and unions is sort of central to socialism and socialist politics. So then, what does that mean for electricity politics? You might not be aware, but electricity has a deep, deep history with socialism. In fact, the first site of a revolution in Russia, very soon after the revolution, Lenin is famously quoted as saying that really for him, communism is Soviet power, which means worker power, but also electrification of the whole country. And, Russia was a very undeveloped country at the time. It was 80% peasants. And again, Lenin was kind of coming from a pretty orthodox Marxist perspective that really the basis for communism or socialism would have to be industrialization. And actually Russia wasn't particularly industrialized at the time. So he felt like the first priority for the revolution was to bring the miracle of modern electricity services to the masses of poor peasant people in Russia. And that was one of the first sort of in their planning of the economy. The sort of electrification program was one of the first things they did. But getting back to the sort of key planks of a socialist electricity politics, the first thing is that unlike our horrible capitalist society, we believe electricity should be like a human right. You know, the winter storm Uri a couple years ago showed that when electricity is cut off, people die. It's essential life-sustaining service in most economies. And we think that this should just be provided much like water and sewage services are. You know, we take for granted that in modern cities, we get these things just provisioned to us as sort of a necessary, essential public service. We think that electricity is sort of in that same realm. And more importantly, socialists look around the world and we actually have to recognize there's, you know, close to 1 billion people that have no electricity service. So if you think about socialism having this internationalist focus on uniting the working class around the world, well, one thing we would be central to our program is making sure everyone around the world has electricity. And you all, I think, are probably familiar with the energy analyst Robert Bryce. He found out that the amount of people around the world that have limited electricity access is even more staggering. Basically, he did some calculations to show that his refrigerator in Texas consumes about 1,000 kilowatt hours per year, and that's more electricity than about 3.3 billion people across the world. So Lenin would be quite disheartened to learn that 100 years after he said those words, still around the world, there's just incredible energy poverty, and nearly half the planet really does not enjoy this incredibly important life-sustaining technology we call electricity. Socialists, the key thing socialists should focus on in sort of politicizing energy is ownership. And we sort of would identify the private capitalist ownership of electricity as the key problem that prevents us from achieving all sorts of goals that we would want to, whether it be delivering electricity as a human right or solving climate change. So therefore, socialists tend to want to fight for public ownership. Obviously, we'd want a more broadly socialist society that abolishes private ownership in general. But one thing I'd like to point out is that just public ownership of electricity is not weird, and it's even, you know, quite predominant in this country, in the United States. And this is from the World Bank, and it only is looking at distribution utilities, but you can see all around the world, public distribution utilities outnumber private ones, particularly in these regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and Pacific. So, but socialists believe that really public ownership gives us, it does not guarantee anything. Obviously, there's lots of bad examples of mismanaged and corrupt public utilities, but it gives us the ability to possibly organize electricity under certain wider public goals and public good orientations, as opposed to just private profit, as we have with investor-owned utilities. Obviously, socialists believe in planning, and the cool thing about electricity is it actually physically requires planning. As you know, it has to be meticulously balanced between supply and load and demand all at once. And this actually it requires an intense level of monitoring, constant planning of the grid and making sure the system is in balance, because as we know, if it isn't in balance, it can be catastrophic for the technology itself. So what socialists would point out, though, is that there's been these attempts to kind of graft on market logics and market competition to a system that fundamentally requires coordinated conscious planning, which, again, the market itself is sort of against planning. It wants to kind of allow prices and decentralized price mechanisms to shape everything. Finally, socialists believe that labor is central, and unions and workers in electricity are highly organized. It's one of the more unionized parts of the economy in the United States. And so therefore, if we're going to have a socialist electricity politics, we really need to put the unions and the workers who do the work in these systems, who have the knowledge and skills to understand how these very complex technological systems work. These are the people that socialists would say should be leading the movements and attempts to kind of create not only a decarbonized electricity grid, but a reliable and stable grid that delivers this service for everyone. And so one thing that we can talk about later is that a lot of the kind of so-called eco-socialist climate politics focused on electricity doesn't actually have much engagement with the workers and the unions that are at the center of these systems, and that I would argue as a socialist have to be central to the transformation of these systems if we do want to transform them. All right, now moving right along. I did want to kind of just give us a sense of what socialists really identify as the problem, which is that we have an electricity system that has a lot of capitalist control of it. Therefore, a lot of our electricity system is organized for profit to the benefit of investors, as opposed to organizing electricity as a public essential service for the better good of society, right? And so that's the key problem, and it has a deep history, and we need to sort of understand that. So many of you probably know who this is, Thomas Edison. And you might know what this picture is. It's Pearl Street Station, the first power station ever in the United States in New York City. But what you might not know is he located this very strategically in the financial district of New York City, a stone's throw from Wall Street, in the hopes of attracting capital for his electricity business. And that, I think, is a telling beginning to our electricity system, that we have this capitalist who is seeking money capital from Wall Street investors to get electricity capitalism off the ground. And really, in many ways, we haven't looked back since, and we've basically had a predominantly capitalist electricity system since. But it became quickly clear to everyone that organized electricity as a capitalist market is nonsensical. It doesn't make a lot of sense, because you get people like Edison, but then other entrepreneurs set up their own power stations, and they're all trying to create distribution lines to customers. And they quickly realize that these lines are crossing, and it doesn't really make logical, rational sense to have multiple electricity lines crossing each other. And so it became clear that this needed to be managed as a kind of as a single entity. And economists basically said that this is something like railroads or like natural gas pipelines. There's something where there's kind of a natural monopoly to these systems, where it makes sense for one organization to organize this system, as opposed to a typical capitalist market with many entrepreneurs competing on a market. So this natural monopoly idea led people like Edison, but also other capitalists, to say, well, okay, let's hand it over to investor-owned monopolies who can then manage the grid for profit. But I just want to add that there was other proposals on the table. And you may have heard that, socialism actually was quite popular in the early 20th century, right when electricity is kind of expanding. And there's this form of city socialism that was really sort of characterized by Milwaukee politics, where they elected a socialist mayor. And it was sometimes referred to as sewer socialism, which believed that, what we need to do is in a city is really develop public services that benefit all working class residents of an urban environment. And so therefore investing in sewage treatment, water delivery, and all sorts of sort of shared collective infrastructure that makes city life good for everyone. And a lot of these same sewer socialists were calling for municipal ownership of electricity and taking public control over distribution grids, at least, if maybe not the generation side, but definitely municipalizing public and owning publicly distribution grids for the benefit of everyone. And so the capitalists who organized electricity at the time saw this kind of sewer socialism or grid socialism as a threat to their interests. And they realized they had to come up with a kind of fix or regulatory answer to this problem. And what they came up with is what the historian, forgetting his first name, is it Richard Hirsch, wrote a book called Power Loss about deregulation. He termed this the utility consensus, where these private investor-owned utilities agreed to be regulated by state-level public utility commissions. We have here in New York State the Public Service Commission. And the idea was that that these investor-owned utilities would be given this natural monopoly where they'd be able to manage the electricity grid as a private for-profit investor-owned entity, as long as they're regulated by the PUC that tells them, you can have a fair rate of return. As long as you're not charging too high of prices on consumers, this is going to be okay. And as you can see from this quote, Insull, who's became one of the sort of characteristic profiteering robber barons of what was called the power trust or the kind of electricity monopolies, he really thought that this state regulation was the best solution because he saw the threat of municipalization and other forms of public ownership on the horizon. He thought this kind of state regulation where it's very rationalized at the state level, the cities aren't involved actually. And so this became the kind of the political fix to this problem, the utility consensus. But a socialist, we would say, this created more problems. It basically created, by granting these monopolies to these profiteers, what did they do? They profiteered. They basically organized these really rapacious holding companies, very corrupt Ponzi scheme-like systems where they basically, ripped off consumers, gouged consumers for their own sort of inflated Wall Street stock shenanigans. And all this led to all sorts of scandals and corruption and problems, which eventually led to the crash of 1929 and in a lot of ways the dissolution of a lot of these holding companies. And Insull himself lost a lot in the crash. And that and basically everyone hated these utilities, much like we hate our utilities today. And by the way, this map is just to show that a lot of these territories that these utilities were given, these sort of regulated territories, service territories, are the same ones that they sort of forged during this utility consensus. And a key factor is that they were given control over the entire system from generation to transmission distribution. So many would say it's only this kind of transmission and distribution which is prone to a natural monopoly, but they basically gave them control over the whole system. And so with all these scandals, with all these critiques of investor-owned utilities, you got the sort of 1930s move towards what me and co-author Fred Stafford have called big public power, this sort of big commitment to public generation as an alternative to these kind of rapacious private utilities. And basically, one of the biggest examples, the Tennessee Valley Authority, what their goal was to develop these incredible hydroelectric resources. And their main goal was just developing cheaper electricity that could really undercut and compete and really compete well with these investor-owned utilities. But they also promoted alternative ownership structures of distribution utilities. They really thought cities should municipalize and buy the power that TVA was creating. And of course, there was the Rural Electrification Administration that gave loans for rural areas to develop rural electric cooperatives and all this kind of stuff. And so this was kind of a little burst of public power, but in the end, a lot of the traditional monopoly territories of investor-owned utilities, they basically stayed where they were and stayed with the same system in place. And eventually, Congress basically forced the TVA to basically put what they called a fence line around their territory to make sure they weren't expanding. Or during the McCarthy era, they're worried about encroaching socialism with the TVA, so they basically forced them to stop expanding. And so in the post-World War II era, we basically had a few little islands of public power, but mostly this sort of utility consensus, investor-owned utilities. was the key factor. Then, but when you get the 70s, you get an energy crisis, and you get environmental movement, and you get a lot of critiques of these big behemoth, some would say rigid and corrupt utilities, as being these sort of things that were so big that needed to be reformed, right? And at the same time, you get this move in society that is moving away from government control, public investment, and you're getting towards what people call sort of a neoliberal sort of focus on opening up markets and letting the free market do its thing. And so in the electricity zone, people started saying, why can't we organize electricity according to markets? So the main result, there's a couple results, but they wanted to subject electricity to more they would call dynamic pricing, where you have marginal cost pricing, where prices are able to reflect different moments of demand and particularly load. But more importantly, they said, well, why, we understand why the wires have to be controlled by one entity, or the distribution lines, but why not generation? Why not open up generation to competition? And that's where you start to get deregulation, restructuring of electricity that starts to open up production and generation to a whole host of what are called merchant generators, or what we call in New York State independent power producers. And these are just people that are producing electricity as capitalists, sort of separate from the whole grid, separate from the whole system. Now, you can say a lot of bad things about these behemoth utilities, but at least they actually controlled the whole system, and they planned it sort of rationally as a system. But now we've sort of opened up to a sort of more chaotic system of competition between generators, kind of trying to compete with each other. And this is, of course, not the case across the country, but it's the case in New York State. It's in the case in many, many states that have gone through this restructuring that has opened up generation to this form of competition, and you get all these different merchant generators. And by the way, all the renewables being produced in our country, for the most part, are almost always these independent power producers. So deregulation has sort of opened up the market for renewable production in this way. And any of you, I know this is a popular book around nuclear folks, but the other result of this restructuring process is it created these markets for wholesale power markets, and these basically regional transmission organizations that kind of took a lot of control away from the utilities in terms of planning the balancing and the load balancing of the system, and started to try to plan this per se through markets, right? And so they basically designed these very complicated auction systems that try to make it a market, but again, electricity is not very good for markets, so it has to be very much planned. You have to have a day-ahead market, you have to have a time of a spot market, you have to have monthly capacity markets, all this kind of complicated market chicanery. And Meredith Angwin's book shows how they create all these sort of crazy rules that we have to have like fuel neutrality, so we can't give preference to particular types of generation. But she shows, like in New England in the winter, like it's really better to have oil that you can store on site as opposed to gas that can only be delivered by pipeline and so forth. Okay, so that took longer than I want, so I'm going to try to speed things up. What I really want to focus on is how a lot of the debate we have over electricity and nuclear and renewables is clouded by markets, the market logics, where we only focus on market prices and market logics. And so stop me if you've heard this before, but we constantly are hearing that renewables are cheaper than ever, and their cheapness is simply a sign that the market itself is creating all this shift in the energy system towards renewables because they're just cheaper than the other ones. And many of you are familiar with the concept of levelized cost of energy comparisons, where you just can put side by side these different energy sources and compare their exchange value costs as if they're similar entities in an overall electricity grid. And of course, renewables advocates will say, just look how cheap they've gotten over the last decade. It's been like a miracle of markets that they've gotten so cheap. And so now it's just simply, you've heard it, it doesn't make sense to have nuclear because it's so costly and because we already have these cheap renewables. So this argument is only on the terrain of exchange value and prices and markets, right? By the way, socialists would ask, how does stuff get so cheap? Socialists would emphasize there's probably deep, horrific labor exploitation behind that cheapness, right? And so it's pretty clear to me that the cheapness of solar over the last decade and a half, let's say, is largely a product of super exploitation of labor in China, where most of the solar panel production is happening. But and of course, you all might have seen this op-ed just about 10 days ago, a week ago, in the Times Albany, where you see these are anti-nuclear people. They constantly are throwing out these numbers about, look, the cost of small modular is this high, but when you look at solar and wind, it's so low, so it makes no sense, right? They're constantly making their arguments on the terrain of exchange value, and then you get reports like this: nuclear is too expensive, it's too costly, blah, 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 blah. And I actually just recently, I was on social media and saw someone post this kind of chart that was just released by IEA last week that just shows, oh, look, the cheapness and the solar, it's all happening, right? And again, the key is you just sort of act as if all these different energy sources are comparable and interchangeable in a grid system. And therefore, this shows that, well, solar is now overtaking coal, and pretty soon it'll be all solar, right? So what I would like to say is socialists would not want to focus so much on markets. We would want to focus on the differential usefulness of these different energy sources and how certain energy fuel sources give you useful properties that other ones don't. And so that's really key to kind of thinking about the grid and electricity as not just a market, but as a system and infrastructure that has to be planned, balanced, and to be a reliable system. And so when we think about use value, renewables might be cheap, but as you know, renewables have very limited use value in their intermittency, right? And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but nuclear, it might be expensive, but it has tremendous use value in its capacity factor. It can run basically 24/7. It can store fuel for many, many months in advance. And so therefore, it's got this tremendous usefulness as something that can be reliable in the overall grid system. Now, renewable people will often say, well, we know about intermittency. That's why we love storage, and storage is now so cheap too, right? Batteries. But of course, this is actually David Roberts, one of the most pro-renewables people you're ever going to find. And here he actually admits that batteries are great and they're cheap, but they can only give us about 8 hours of power storage. And what we really need to solve the intermittency problem is what is called long duration storage. And to give us 100, 300, 500 hours or more. And it's quite astonishing when I read this, because he says, what will work for long duration storage? And he goes, good question, no one knows. And the problem with all the long duration storage technologies now is they're too costly, right? So everything we've been hearing about renewables being so cheap, well, they won't work unless you have long duration storage. And then, oh, by the way, the problem with long duration storage is too expensive. So, you know, when you compare these energy sources as, again, standalone commodities that could just be compared price levels, like you're buying different pairs of shoes, it seems so great that they're so cheap. But when you look at it as a system, it's really different. And then, of course, we all know that one of the most important use values of nuclear is it has a tiny, tiny land footprint. And you can generate so much electricity with so little land usage. And obviously, it's quite the opposite with wind and solar. And so all these sort of use value benefits, social benefits, I would say, to nuclear get lost in this market debate. And by the way, this is a brand new, and I'm sorry, it's kind of faded. This article just came out that tried to develop a new concept called levelized full system cost of electricity, and found that when you take these energy sources and act as if, what if they had to supply the whole grid as a system, what would be the cost of providing the power? And then you have to integrate all the cost of storage. In this case, it would be probably like ridiculous amounts of batteries or something. And yeah, as you can see, solar and wind don't perform so well in the full system cost. You also see nuclear is obviously not performing as well as some of these fossil fuels. But if you're concerned about climate change, you have to understand that fossil fuels have a serious cost that isn't captured by the market, and it's called carbon dioxide emissions, and it's basically creating an unstable climate. So when you integrate those costs, these numbers might look much more beneficial for nuclear. Okay, so nuclear has tremendous use value, and we shouldn't make our debates about electricity purely about exchange value in markets and all so forth. So the next point is that socialists believe public power is good, but we should also point out that public power has been really crucial for decarbonization and also nuclear power. I would point you to this, when the Green New Deal came on the scene, this is a great article by Jameson McBride that just makes the case that if you want sort of large scale, rapid decarbonization, it's basically been public investment that has done it. And it shows that obviously the most rapid decarbonization in history really has been France. And we know what France did. We all hear nuclear is too slow, right? Well, this is just in The Economist last week. They call it the atomic armada. And you see this incredible build out of nuclear plants in a extremely 10 to 15 year period. And that was all public investment, and they weren't doing it to make profits necessarily for investors. I'm sure there were some people making profits along the way, but it was because of the energy crisis, and they thought as a society we need to invest in this for the public good. We need to get our electricity system off fossil fuels, and we need to do it as a public mission. And they sort of achieved these things on a much more broader scale than just private profit, right? Okay. Another good example where there's a lot of public ownership in the grid is Sweden. And as you can see, Sweden has got a heck of a lot of hydroelectric, but it also has a lot of nuclear, and it has a fair amount of wind power. And I think this is an incredibly nearly 100% decarbonized grid, and it's largely publicly owned. And they've been able to invest in these really reliable forms of zero carbon electricity like a hydro and nuclear that take a lot of upfront investment, right? And sure, it seems costly when you just have this sort of deregulated markets where everyone has to privately bear the cost. But when you publicly subsidize these costs, you can actually deliver cheaper electricity once you socialize the costs from the public sector and then get these things up and running, right? And so one of the things I want to leave you with is this is a little emoji that really, if nuclear has to compete in a free market, it's probably not going to win, right? And if we want to spread nuclear power, it needs socialism, or at least it needs public ownership and public investment that can say that we need to do this for broader goals than private investor profit. We need to do it for the climate. We need to do it for the public good. We need to do it for a stable, reliable grid. But that needs, I think, public investment, right?
Yeah.
And I would direct you to my co-author, Fred Stafford, had an excellent new article on why we need a nuclear New Deal, where it basically says, to solve climate, we should empower the largest public utility in the United States, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And you might not be aware, but the only entity to get a nuclear plant up and running in the 21st century in the United States is the TVA. The TVA launched the Watts Bar plant. It took them a while, but they did launch it just a few years ago. And that is something they felt they wanted to do as part of their public mission to build not only a more reliable grid in the TVA territory, but a low carbon grid. And as you can see, TVA still has some work to do, and there's a lot of environmental organizations that are always critiquing them because they're building gas plants. But look, they've made tremendous progress in decarbonizing their grid. They have a 57% carbon-free grid, and they are very keen on doing more nuclear in their territory. And a nuclear New Deal would try to get rid of that fence line and say, why not empower the TVA to build these things all over the country? If we really believe we're in an existential crisis of climate change. Why can't we empower a public mission entity to build the energy system we need? Okay. Finally, labor and unions, and this is key. And socialists like to differentiate between, labor unions have like the trade union leaders, and sometimes we think that they can be quite bureaucratic and corrupt. And you have the rank and file workers, where socialists typically believe it's those workers that have really the power to organize militant action. But either way, you can see that unions in the electricity sector are quite fond of nuclear power. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers has been a staunch proponent of nuclear, particularly as a climate solution, but also as just a good source of jobs for their members, right? And whenever nuclear plants are being threatened to close down, you see rank and file workers going out into the streets rallying to keep these plants open. And you can see, God bless these heroic Indian Point activists that lost the battle. But these activists, and you can see a lot of workers marching in this movement to save Diablo Canyon, they were victorious in this kind of movement. And so a lot of people are talking about, and courtesy, thanks to Chris Kiefer for sharing this image of him organizing with unions for a nuclear as a just transition. And so there's a lot of talk in the climate space about just transition, how to shift fossil fuel workers out of the fossil economy to a green economy. And almost everyone assumes that means they're going to start working in solar and wind farms, but we could actually take existing fossil fuel powered power plants and replace them with nuclear, hook it straight up to the transmission that's already there, and have a whole set of good, long-lasting, skilled, high-wage, unionized jobs to just take the place of those jobs that were in the coal sector before. And there's already a lot of activity about trying to think about taking these coal plants that are actually been closed for many years now and reviving them, reviving whole communities with unionized jobs for nuclear plants. Okay. And by the way, the renewable energy industry is quite anti-union, and it's actually got some of the most horrific labor conditions you can imagine. It's very transient work. People go from site to site, solar farm to solar farm. I would really encourage you all to read these two articles. They're stunning in terms of, these jobs are serviced by these dystopian temp agencies called like People Ready that send these workers, precarious workers, from site to site. They're subject to all sorts of dangerous conditions like extreme heat. And as you can see here, alligators and snakes have been seen as a workplace threat for these solar workers. This article on the right really talks about a tension between projects that try to get union contracts for building something like a solar farm, and then how they have to compete against these low-wage temp agencies that hire out very precarious non-union labor. So it's not pretty. And the most important part is that most of these jobs are temporary. And once you build a solar farm and a wind farm, that it's maybe 2-3 jobs that are permanent. So unlike traditional centralized power plants, which still are the bedrock of any stable, reliable grid, these types of jobs are not really long-lasting jobs for the working class. Okay, I'm going to finally get to, I do think we have to confront the fact that socialism has been on the left, and the left has really been for many years now, let's say like 50, 60 years, has been embroiled in a kind of new left that emerged in the 1960s and then into the 1970s that was incredibly shaped by the environmental movement and particularly the anti-nuclear movement. And this is deeply entrenched in most left-wing people, and particularly people of a certain age that came of age politically during the 1960s, and including someone I'm a big fan of, huge fan of this guy, Bernie Sanders, but he also is in some ways a product of this 1960s leftism. And of course, you probably know he was a big proponent of closing Vermont Yankee in Vermont. His presidential campaigns had lots of wonderful stuff socialists love, but it was pretty anti-nuclear. It had all this sort of magical 100% renewable stuff in it. In fact, a lot of climate people critiqued him for being anti-nuclear. And so I think a lot of ways the left has sort of been has gone from, a mass working class movement to a largely academic movement and largely movement embroiled in non-government organizations and NGOs, and environmental NGOs are just really anti-nuclear. And we have one right here in New York, Alliance for a Green Economy, that put on an event about the viability of 100% renewable energy, talking about no nukes and no gas. To me, this just shows total lack of understanding of what a real stable, reliable grid would need. And I think it's very hard to imagine getting rid of both nuclear and gas and having that reliability. We have a socialist public power campaign you're all aware of in New York State, and there we go. And this is fighting for, again, it's for the public power agency NYPA to build renewables, and they exclude nuclear from the legislation. But this is not a coalition for public power that's really rooted in the workers and the labor and the unions that are embedded in this electricity sector. As you can see, you can't really see this, but if you go to their website and you check out their partners, it's a bunch of environmental NGOs, and you can see in central New York, you can't see it, but right there, it's basically Alliance for a Green Economy. You have many other green NGOs at the core of this coalition. So in many ways, sort of leftism, socialism, eco-socialism, and green NGOs and this kind of anti-nuclearism have become joined at the hip. And it's very difficult for people like me to kind of get much traction with these groups who have this sort of more radical degrowth agenda, and which again kind of goes against that original mission that I think socialism has of, like developing abundance for all. So me and my co-author Fred Staver were trying to sort of develop a different left perspective. And in this article, which I would love you all check it out, where we try to argue that one problem with the left today is they sort of idealize decentralized, small-scale, renewable, or other kinds of small-scale energy generation, like energy co-ops and community-owned energy. And actually, we argue that this kind of helps provide cover for what has been happening to our electricity system, which is taking the large-scale electricity like the TVA and like big centralized generation and subjecting it to this kind of deregulation that allows all these merchant generators and small capitalists to kind of enter the scene. And we say that basically this kind of ideology of decentralized electricity really provides a basis for this sort of deregulation of electricity, and particularly renewables themselves as beneficiaries of this merchant generation, sort of small independent power producer system, have been able to get tax credits for their renewable energy projects. And you've probably seen that Warren Buffett is notorious for basically realizing that he can shield his vast wealth by taking equity ownership of these wind farms or solar farms and getting the tax credit. And so you have basically, and still with the IRA, with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's just a lot of tax credits, and it's going to be ways for rich people to shelter their wealth from taxes through renewable projects. And we also have a whole set of middle upper income people who get solar panels on their roof and are able to take advantage of like net metering things in California that give them basically subsidies, while the poorest and lower class people have to sort of pay higher rates to keep the whole system going, right? And so this kind of deregulation of electricity has benefited wealthy investors, it's benefited upper income homeowners, but it's not that shouldn't be something we argue for socialism. So the main point is that this sort of eco-socialism has taken a rigidly focused on 100% renewables and decentralized renewable energy as being the only pathway we can go. But if you really want to have a really reliable grid and a decarbonized grid, it's very clear that centralized generation like hydroelectric, like nuclear, these have to be the bedrock of the system, and we cannot abandon those kinds of really powerful, reliable decarbonized options. So in conclusion, I'm sorry I've gone much longer than I planned. Just revisiting, what is socialism? So production for social need. We think nuclear provides all these socially useful benefits to society. the climate being number one, but also, good jobs, life-sustaining middle-class jobs. Also, taking very little amount of land to produce tremendous amounts of electricity. It provides a much more stable grid. All these socially beneficial use values should be taken into account when we plan our electricity system. And we're not allowed to do that because basically it's mainly run for profit. Nuclear energy, for all people that critique it, it is an abundant, powerful source of electricity that can generate tremendous amounts of abundance. And if we want to electrify that close to 1 billion people that lack electricity, we should think about the abundance that nuclear energy provides. And again, another thing that Marx and Engels talked about was how capitalism really centralizes and collectivizes the productive forces into these kind of centralized factories. Well, that's the same as these centralized power plants that really, when it comes down to it, are the most efficient way to deliver power to millions of consumers is through these kind of centralized power generation types of entities. It's only recently where people have become sort of almost ideologically fixated on this idea of this sort of small scale decentralized grid. Obviously, again, electricity requires planning, but I would argue nuclear makes it easier to plan a stable grid because you can count on it. It's got that incredible capacity factor. It can store the fuel on site. It can do all these things. It takes very little land. It's got all and when you have that stable baseload part of the grid, it makes integrating all the other parts of the system that much more easy. So Socialists would really emphasize that we really need to treat electricity not as a set of different energy sources that are standalone commodities that we can compare price points. It's a system. It's an infrastructure that has to be managed and balanced and all this stuff. And we have to think about each entity as part of a whole system. And nuclear fits so well, as anyone who in France will tell you, it works so well to create a broader system. And so, and you need to plan that system, and nuclear would do well. Finally, labor. I've already made this point, but unions, workers in the electricity sector tend to be very positive about nuclear energy. So if we want a climate politics that appeals to those workers, to those unions, and actually could harness their power as workers to change our electricity system for the better, we should probably listen to them. And what they often say is they like nuclear energy quite a lot, and that nuclear has to be a central part of our climate solution. And so let's let the workers lead on that. If we're socialists, that's what we have to do. And finally, I will stop talking and thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.